You've heard of Weimar Germany. Most people have. Wheelbarrows, banknotes. A cautionary tale repeated so often, it has started to feel almost theatrical. But the worst inflation in recorded history did not happen in Berlin. It happened in Hungary in 1946, in a country so physically damaged and politically exposed that money stopped functioning, not just as savings, but as time. In July 1946, consumer prices were rising at a rate equivalent to 41.9 quadrillion % for the month. On average, prices doubled about every 15 hours. That meant the note in your pocket in the morning could lose half its buying power before nightfall. And that is the first payoff in this story. Hyperinflation is not simply expensive living, it is the destruction of the interval between earning and eating. Hungary entered this collapse after war had already done the first round of killing. Transport was broken. Industry was badly damaged. Budapest had been devastated by siege warfare. The tax base was shattered. At the same time, Soviet occupation forces lived off the country, and reparations claims pulled real goods outward, while domestic institutions tried to hold society together with paper promises. This is why the official story is always too clean. People are told inflation begins when governments print too much money. That is true, but incomplete. In Hungary, paper issuance accelerated because the state was trying to govern the ruins of a broken economy, while real output, transport, inventory, and fiscal credibility were collapsing underneath it. The press ran faster because the country itself no longer could. Now place yourself inside one ordinary afternoon. You finish work. You are paid. You begin the walk home. And during that walk, your wage is already dying. That is where the story begins. Not at the central bank. Not in a textbook. But in the shrinking distance between a paycheck and a loaf of bread. The collapse did not arrive as one dramatic moment. It arrived as a change in speed. At first, people still tried to think in normal categories. Monthly wages, posted prices, savings, rent, inventory. But hyperinflation destroys those habits in sequence. A price quoted this morning becomes fiction by afternoon. A wage negotiated for next week becomes an insult before it is even paid. A shopkeeper who waits too long to restock is not making a bookkeeping error. He is committing a fatal timing error. By the summer of 1946, Hungarian prices were rising so fast that the old logic of money had broken completely. Guinness records the July 1946 monthly inflation rate at 41.9 quadrillion %, with prices doubling roughly every 15 hours. Hungarian Central Bank historical material notes that by 10 July 1946, the daily depreciation rate reached 348.46%, implying near doubling in about 11 hours under the worst phase of the collapse. This is where the spectacle usually takes over the story. The famous giant banknotes, the absurd denominations, the 100 quintillion pengő note that has become the symbol of the entire disaster. And yes, those notes were real. Hungary issued denominations so large that they sounded satirical, even to people living through them. But the denomination is not the mechanism. The mechanism is what those notes reveal. The state was no longer issuing money as a stable unit of deferred purchasing power. It was issuing emergency paper into a system where the good side of the economy had been wrecked, fiscal capacity had collapsed, and confidence in future value had almost disappeared. The note got larger because the economy underneath it got smaller, weaker, and less believable. Now take that out of the archive and put it on the street. A worker is paid at noon. He does not go home first. He does not sit on the cash. He does not compare options. He runs an exchange race. Paper into bread, paper into lard, paper into potatoes, paper into shoes for a child before the seller changes the chalk on the board. In a functioning currency regime, prudence means saving and planning. In a terminal inflation, prudence becomes conversion speed. The person who hesitates is not more disciplined. He is poorer by evening. That is the part many modern viewers miss. Hyperinflation is not only an attack on wealth, it is an attack on sequence, earn, hold, decide, purchase. That sequence breaks apart. Once it breaks, society starts searching for a different ruler of value. And in Hungary, that ruler was increasingly not money at all. It was calories, tax indexation, and anything that could survive the night better than paper. Now make the problem smaller, and more brutal. Forget the giant numbers for a moment. Forget the banknotes with impossible strings of zeros. Ask the only question that matters inside a household. If your paycheck becomes materially weaker in the 20 minutes it takes to walk home, how do you feed your family tonight? That is where Hungary's inflation crisis stops being a monetary story and becomes a biological one. By the spring of 1946, one response had already emerged inside the labor market: the calorie wage. Contemporary and later economic studies describe a system in which workers were paid partly in money and partly in enough goods in kind to maintain basic subsistence. In other words, labor was no longer being priced against an official wage scale alone. It was being repriced against the minimum energy required to keep a worker alive and productive. This matters more than the spectacle of hyperinflation itself. Once wages are implicitly linked to calories, the fiction is over. Society is admitting that currency is no longer a reliable bridge between work and survival. The worker does not really want more pengő. Hey, he wants potatoes, fat, flour, coal, soap, anything that can cross the gap between payday and the next morning. The unit of account may still be printed by the state, but the true unit of survival has shifted to food, fuel, and immediate use. That shift also tells you who gets trapped first. The people with fixed cash claims lose earliest. Pensioners, clerks, salaried employees, anyone paid on a lag, anyone holding savings in paper, anyone still trusting weekly or monthly settlement. Even official attempts to preserve real wages show the scale of the damage. One retrospective statistical study notes that post-war wage policy was anchored far below earlier real standards, with workers' real wages targeted at only a fraction of pre-war levels. And it tells you who adapts first. Not the person with the highest nominal income, but the person closest to useful goods, usable networks, and immediate exchange. The butcher adapts. The railway worker with access to transport information adapts. The factory hand who can turn wages into food within the hour adapts. The family with relatives in the countryside adapts. So this was the real market signal of 1946. When money failed, labor did not stop being priced. It was simply repriced in human maintenance. By early 1946, even the state had begun to admit something humiliating. The pengő still existed, but it no longer measured reality well enough for the government to govern through it. That is why one of the most revealing inventions of the crisis was the Adópengő, the tax pengő. It began on 1 January 1946 as a special accounting unit designed to protect state revenues from the collapse of the regular currency. At first, it was used mainly by the government and banks. Later, instruments denominated in Adópengő moved outward into wider circulation because the official unit of money was disintegrating too quickly to carry even basic fiscal functions. That distinction matters. When a government creates a parallel indexed unit inside a hyperinflation, it is making a forensic confession. It is saying, our currency may still be legal tender, but we ourselves no longer trust it to hold value long enough to tax, budget, or settle obligations coherently. So the crisis had entered a new phase. Hungary was no longer dealing only with inflation in the ordinary sense. It was dealing with a split between the visible currency and the functional currency. One unit circulated because the law still said it was money. The other circulated because institutions needed some moving reference point that could keep up with the speed of depreciation. In effect, the state had started building its own shadow ruler of value underneath the collapsing one. And this is where the pattern becomes modern. People often imagine hyperinflation as pure chaos. Everybody bartering randomly, nobody able to calculate anything. But the historical record shows something more disciplined. When official money fails, society begins searching for replacement calculation devices. Sometimes it is a foreign currency. Sometimes it is food. Sometimes it is gold, cigarettes, fuel, or labor hours. In Hungary, one of those devices was indexation through the Adópengő, happening. It did not restore trust. It did not create abundance. But it gave the state and parts of the economy a way to chase reality more quickly than the old pengő could. And notice the deeper lesson. When inflation becomes extreme enough, the central economic question stops being, what is money? It becomes, which unit updates fastest against reality? Because if one unit adjusts daily while another dies hourly, then neither one is truly stable. One is simply less dead than the other. And that forced households into the next brutal rule of survival: do not hold. Do not admire nominal gains. Do not wait for a better price. Move. This is the rule that separates archival curiosity from survival knowledge. In a hyperinflation, hoarding currency is not caution. It is exposure. The winning behavior is not accumulation. It is conversion velocity. That sounds reckless to people raised inside stable money. Under normal conditions, the disciplined household delays gratification, compares prices, preserves liquidity, and thinks in weeks, months, or years. But Hungary in 1946 inverted the moral logic of finance, the household that behaved conservatively in the old sense, saving cash, waiting for better options, trusting the next payday, was often the household that got hit hardest. The household that survived was the one that learned to shorten the time between receipt and conversion almost to zero. Studies of hyperinflation repeatedly show this pattern. As money's real value collapses faster, people reduce real cash balances and accelerate spending because holding money itself becomes the loss-making position. So imagine the daily choreography. A wage is paid. Before that payment can decay further, part of it is pushed into food. Another part goes into fuel. Another into whatever durable necessity may still be available. Shoes, cloth, soap, tools, spare parts. Anything with use value outruns paper with collapsing time value. This is why hyperinflation often creates the illusion of frantic consumption, but much of that spending is not consumption in the ordinary sense. It is emergency conversion. People are not buying luxuries because they feel rich. They are escaping the burn rate of money, and that leads directly to the shadow pricing matrix. Once official prices become unstable, households and workers need a private internal scale, not a theoretical one. A field scale, a way to ask, what is 1 hour of my labor worth in bread, potatoes, cooking fat, coal, transport, or shelter? What good or service can be traded for enough calories to keep the household functioning for another day or another week? In Hungary, the calorie wage and in-kind compensation were early versions of that logic. Labor was being translated away from nominal units and back into survival units. That is the uncomfortable truth. When money stops storing value, you are forced to become your own pricing authority. And the first question is no longer, how much am I paid? It is, paid in what that still matters by tonight. So what actually survives when paper wealth fails? Not optimism, not loyalty to official units, not nominal gains, not the comforting illusion that a large number printed on a note still represents stored work. What survives is much narrower than that. Useful goods survive. Fast conversion survives. Skills that can be exchanged quickly survive. Access survives. Networks survive. Any private pricing system tied to food, fuel, transport, repair, medicine, shelter, or foreign purchasing power survives longer than a collapsing domestic unit of account. Hungary proved this in the most extreme form ever recorded. The stabilization only came when the old regime of decay was ended and the forint replaced the pengő on 1 August 1946. closing one of history's shortest and most violent experiments in total monetary disintegration. But the deeper lesson is not that every inflation,